Hello and welcome to this video podcast for evolution and diversity. In this video, we're going to begin our discussion of seeded plants. And the first types of seeded plants we're going to talk about are the gymnosperms. Just to give you a frame of reference, one of those gymnosperms is a pine tree. And I'm sure we've all seen a pine tree. So that might give you this helpful reference point as we begin this discussion of the gymnosperms. As we get started talking about gymnosperms, we're going to first begin talking about some of the evolutionary advances that preceded the seed that were important to occur so that the seed eventually could arise. And then we're going to spend some time talking about some of the adaptive advantages of seeds. And then we'll move to some characteristics of gymnosperms, and then we'll talk about some different groups of gymnosperms and talk about some distinguishing features of each of those groups. Now, the evolution of seeded plants, including the gymnosperms, but also the angiosperms, which we'll talk about in the next video. But together, they have resulted in over 400,000 species. Now, these 400 different species live in a wide variety of habitats across the world. One of the reasons they were able to become so diverse is largely because of the adaptation of having a seed. In fact, I think it's safe to say that the seed was an evolutionary game changer. If you remember a couple of videos ago, we talked about how the cuticle was a big game changer in evolution because it allowed plants to move slowly away from water and be safe from drying out. The seed now is this next evolutionary game changer. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the seed, but what you should know right now as we move forward with this discussion is that the seed protects the growing embryo. It helps in dispersal. And we'll come back to this later. But being able to disperse that seed to a wide variety of habitats really helped explode these 400,000 species. And lastly, it has this dormant stage. And we're going to come back to all of this in just a little bit. But before we get to this, what I want to focus on right now are the adaptations that led to the seed. And I'm almost out of room here, but I want to list them here so I can go into greater detail on the next whiteboard. The first is a dominant sporophyte. We've already talked about the dominant sporophyte when we talked about the seedless vascular plants, but we're going to talk about why this was so important as we move towards having a seed. And then we're going to talk about the advantage of going from Homospory to Heterospory. And then the third adaptation that was very important to lead to the seed was the formation of pollen. So let's talk about this dominant sporophyte stage for just a little bit next. So remember, the dominant sporophyte stage started with the seedless vascular plants. And for the rest of the plants that we're going to talk about, we're going to stay with this dominant sporophyte stage. But a couple things you need to remember about this dominant sporophyte stage, and that is that it is the diploid state. That is the 2N state. Whereas the gametophyte stage is a haploid. And so why is it important that it's a diploid? A hypothesis is that diploid cells allow more efficient response to varying environmental conditions. A main part of this is that as a diploid, many of the gene pairs they have of the different alleles may exist as a heterozygote. So as an example, maybe at the allele A, one of those alleles is big A and one is little a. And this just adds genetic diversity, so when that plant reproduces and produces the next generation, you will get a greater genetic diversity in those progeny. You'll talk a lot more about heterozygote states and some of the advantages to being a heterozygote when you take genetics. So let's talk about this process of going from homospory to heterospory. Let's first talk about homospory. This is what we've seen up until this point. So this is very common in non-vascular plants and seedless vascular plants. Now, I didn't use the term homospory, but I described it. So essentially, homospory is the production of single type of spores. So in non-vascular and seedless vascular plants, a structure called the sporangium produces spores. These spores then will develop into a gametophyte. Now this gametophyte we say is bisexual. And that is because this gametophyte produces both sperm and egg. And I said this when we talked about the non-vascular and seedless vascular plants, when I said that the gametophyte was independent. And so maybe it makes a little bit more sense now thinking about this. And when I say it's independent, what that means is that this gametophyte all by itself can produce sperm and egg that can then fertilize each other and produce the zygote and then develop into that sporophyte. So what I want to do is go back and look at this figure that we've looked at before from your textbook talking about the alternation of generation for seedless vascular plants. So here is this figure from your textbook looking at the alternation of generation of the seedless vascular plants. And I just wanted to point out in this picture some of the things I just wrote for you on the whiteboard. We have this single sporangium and it produces spores shown here. These spores will then develop into a single gametophyte. And again, remember we call this gametophyte for these kinds of plants bisexual because as it matures, this same structure, it's a single structure here, produces both sperm and egg. It is independent. All by itself, it produces the gametes necessary to make the zygote and ultimately that next stage, the sporophyte stage. Now let's go back to the whiteboard and talk about heterospory. Plants that use heterospory would be the seeded vascular plants. The gymnosperms, which is the focus for today, and the angiosperms, which we'll talk about tomorrow. And as you might guess with the root word hetero, that heterospory means that they produce different types of spores. If you remember, with homospory, you had just a single sporangium. But with heterospory, there are two different structures made. The first is the microsporangium. And the second is the megasporangium. Let's talk about the microsporangium first. The microsporangium, they produce microspores. Remember, the sporangium of homospory only produced one type of spores. So here we see the first difference. We see microspores. And then the megasporangium conveniently make something called megaspores. Two different kinds of spores. The microspores then will go on to produce the male gametophyte. And the megaspores will go on to produce the female gametophyte. The male gametophyte will produce sperm. And the female gametophyte will produce the egg. We have two different structures making two different types of spores, and each one leads to the production of a different gamete. Because of that, we say that this kind of alternation of generation, these gametophytes are dependent on each other. The male gametophyte now needs the female gametophyte, and vice versa. This separation of these two structures in heterospory turns out to be an incredibly important evolutionary event for land plants because it ultimately led to the adaptation of pollen and then to seeds. Before we talk about pollen, I want to go back to the figure from your textbook, a different figure now, but one that's going to show alternation of generations of gymnosperms to kind of point out some of these features that we see in the gymnosperms. All right, so as you look at this alternation of generation, you'll see a lot of common features that we've seen before. You'll see the mature sporophyte stage shown here. It's diploid. Again, that's an advantage for this dominant sporophyte stage. If you remember, in the seedless plants, there was just one arrow going to the sporangium. Here, we have an arrow going to the microsporangium that produces the microspores that will then make the male gametophyte. The male gametophyte will then make the sperm, which will be used to fertilize the egg. There's this additional step, which we're going to talk about in a moment, called the pollen grain, but we might as well point it out here so you can remember what I'm talking about. The pollen grain is where the sperm is going to be stored. And that's going to be really important in just a moment. So kind of keep this visual in your mind. Okay, now this other path down here produces the megasporangium. This megasporangium then has a diploid nucleus that will divide, producing 4 haploid megaspores. Now only one of those megaspores will ultimately become the egg, very similar to what we would see in animals as they go through meiosis. So we have one egg here, and in a moment we'll talk how this pollen grain will deliver the sperm to this megasporangium to fertilize the egg. Once it's fertilized, an embryo will form and it will be protected inside of this seed. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. When the seed germinates, it will begin to form the sporophyte stage, and then it will grow into this large mature sporophyte. All right, let's go back to the whiteboard, and I want to talk about pollen next. Now before I go back to the whiteboard to talk about pollen, I want to point out where we're going to find the megasporangium and the microsporangium structures in a typical gymnosperm. Here we see a gymnosperm tree here, and this one tree will contain both types of structures that will grow the egg up here and grow the sperm down here. Typically, these female cones are going to be found in the upper part of the tree. I suspect not in all types of gymnosperms, but in many types of gymnosperms. The male cone, which produces the sperm, or more appropriately produces the pollen that will then deliver the sperm, we'll see on the lower branches. But they're the same tree, but they're dependent on each other. They need each other still. They could cross-pollinate with the same tree, or the pollen could be taken to a different tree, fertilize a different egg. Okay, I've talked a lot about pollen, but I really haven't described it very well yet, so I'd like to go back to the whiteboard now and talk a little bit about pollen. Before we talk about pollen, let's remind ourselves some of the limitations that non-vascular and seedless vascular plants had. So non-vascular, I'm just going to put NV for non-vascular, and seedless vascular required water in order for the sperm to fertilize the egg. And this had some limitations. For the non-vascular plants, that meant it had to stay closer to the ground, so it was near the moist soil. For the seedless vascular plants, it had to have a way of still using water to move the sperm to the egg. So being able to move sperm without water was a big evolutionary step. It allowed the plants to survive further away from water and further away from the ground. And this is what pollen does for plants. Now remember, when we talked about heterospory, we had the microspore that grew into the male gametophyte. And this male gametophyte is what we like to call the pollen grain. This pollen grain has a very tough outer coating that protects the male gametophyte and the sperm that will be made inside of this pollen grain. So I'm going to erase this so I can talk a little bit more about the pollen grain. I said this at the bottom of the last whiteboard, but I want to put it here just so it's all together. This tough outer coat protects the male gametophyte. It can survive in the air with no water. It can survive for many, many years, actually, inside of this pollen grain. It's small enough to be carried away by wind or by other animals. When it lands near an egg, it releases the sperm for fertilization. Everything we've talked about here does not require water. So this again was a huge benefit for plants as they diversified. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this last step here, how the sperm actually makes it to the egg. So what I'm going to draw here is the megasporangium. Remember, the megasporangium produces the egg. The pollen grain I'm going to draw right here. Remember, the pollen grain will contain the sperm. All right, I redrew this megasporangium here because I initially drew it too wide, and it wouldn't have been as clear as to why the pollen grain couldn't just fall right down here. But as the pollen grain lands here, in order to release the sperm that's inside of it, it has to form something we call a pollen tube that extends from the pollen grain down near the egg. So this is the pollen tube. And once this pollen tube has been formed, extending towards the egg, it will release, that is, the pollen grain will release the sperm that are stored inside of the pollen grain. The nuclei in the egg will now fertilize with one of these sperm containing the other haploid nucleus. After fertilization, this egg becomes the zygote. After fertilization. And we'll pick up the story in just a moment when we start talking about the seed. All right, let's move on to this second learning objective for today, and that is to talk about the adaptive advantages of the seed. Remember, the plant has already done many great things in its evolution to get to this point of a seed. We've talked before about how the plant developed strategies to protect the egg and sperm. In the seedless vascular plants, we talked about the Antheridia and the Archegonia and how they protected the egg and sperm. The megasporangium and the microsporangium in the seeded vascular plants, how they protect the egg and sperm as they develop. We also talked about the importance of retaining the embryo so the parents could nourish it. And we just talked about pollen and how pollen was really important because that allowed fertilization in the absence of water. Now, of course, these are all really important, and we see why they're important. However, one of these turns out to be a limitation as well, and that is our second one here. Because the embryo is being retained in the parent so the parent can nourish it, that means the sporophyte has to live in the same location as the parent gametophyte. So again, as we're thinking about seedless vascular plants like the ferns, this was a big advantage because those embryos would receive the proper nutrition. But there might be an advantage if the embryo could be dispersed away from the parent and still receive the nutrients. And so we're going to overcome this limitation with seeds. So let's draw this seed here. And a few things I want to point out for you. And the first is that a seed contains that fertilized egg, the embryo. Ultimately, that's the purpose of the seed, right? We need to nourish and protect the embryo. But how do we nourish and protect the embryo? Well, we protect the embryo by having a very thick, and I'm going to just draw this a little thicker here, outer coat here. And so this is really important in protecting the embryo. But now we need to be able to provide nutrients for the embryo. Because remember, that's why in the seedless vascular plants, the embryo has to stay close to the parents because it needs that nutrients. So the seed now has to replace that. So I'm just going to draw the background here in blue. And this is the female gametophyte. And this provides that nourishment for the growing embryo. And ultimately, this new embryo is going to develop into a new sporophyte. And because it has its own nutrient supply and it's protected by this thick coat, it can go far away from its parents. It will no doubt make its parents very sad, but it's time to let the embryo grow out and grow on its own. All right, I'd like to spend a little bit of time now talking about some of these other adaptations of the seed. We've already talked about this thick outer coat, the formation of this nourishing gametophyte. And so let's talk about some other adaptations. And this other adaptation I want to talk about is something called seed dormancy. And so in seed dormancy, what I'm talking about is this egg, is this seed with the zygote in it becoming metabolically inactive. I shouldn't say inactive, I should say less active. Remember, this embryo is still going to be protected by that seed coat here. And so sometimes it will hit this stage of inactivity. And why does it do that? Well, it does that because the environmental conditions are less favorable. This could be things like the temperature isn't optimal, lower nutrients, as I'll show with the down arrow, less water. And even though the seed and all these adaptations make it so water is less important, it's still important. They're still going to need water. Now what happens is when the conditions become favorable, they will exit this metabolically less active state and germinate. By germinating, I mean the embryo will start to grow and eventually it will form that sporophyte. And let's look at this picture here just to show you what I mean by germination and breaking this dormancy phase. And so you can see here you have your seed down here, and maybe at some point this seed doesn't have the right nutrients to survive, and so it hits this stage of dormancy. It will then begin to break out of the seed, as you see here, and begin to form the stem of the plant, the roots of the plant, and eventually it's going to pop out of the soil and begin to extend its stem and then forming these leaves. But it can stay in this state of dormancy for quite some time until the conditions are favorable. Once it starts its route out of the seed, there's really no stopping it at that point. All right, this last adaptation I want to talk about is seed dispersal. We hinted at this earlier when I talked about how the seed could be separated from the parents by greater distance because it had its own nutrient. But how does it get to different places? And there's a few ways it could do that. It could hitch a ride. Some seeds have types of spines on them or some kind of projection that will allow them to stick to a passing animal or to your foot or to your shoe. And then that animal becomes a vehicle to move that seed to a new place, flying or floating away. Even though these adaptations have reduced the necessity of water, seeds can still float to other locations and disperse further away from their parents, or they could fly away by the wind blowing them in a new direction. All right, this last method of dispersal I want to talk about is as a food source. This is primarily talking about angiosperms, and that is because angiosperms produce fruits that we'll learn about in the next video. And as an animal eats this fruit, it will also eat the seed that is within the fruit. Now the animal is going to get all the nutrients it needs from the fruit, but it's not going to be able to digest that seed. So when the animal is done eating the fruit, it will wander away from the place where it found the fruit, and it will leave that seed in its feces somewhere else. And then that seed can now germinate and grow into a new sporophyte. All right, now I'd like to move on to our third objective, and that is to describe the characteristics of gymnosperms. And all these characteristics we've talked about before, but let's just list them here. The first is that they have heterospory. They also have seeds. And they have pollen. And it's not really a characteristic of them necessarily, but I also want to say that they are monophyletic. Remember, the non-vascular plants, they were paraphyletic. The seedless vascular plants were paraphyletic. So this is the first one we've talked about that are monophyletic. Let's look at the phylogenetic tree to show you what I mean by that. So we see here in this phylogenetic tree, we see all the vascular plants. We see the seedless vascular plants here that we've already talked about. And then we see the gymnosperms, which we're talking about today, and the angiosperms. While it is true that the characteristics I just mentioned that are found in gymnosperms, heterospory, pollen, and seeds, are also found in angiosperms. So you might think, well, maybe that means they are paraphyletic. But if you look at the common ancestor of all gymnosperms, it's this one right here. And this common ancestor leads to all of these descendants of gymnosperms, and only these descendants of gymnosperms. So we can say that gymnosperms are monophyletic. Angiosperms are also monophyletic, that we'll talk about next. All right, now let's move on to this last learning objective, and that is to list the different groups of gymnosperms and identify some of their distinguishing or interesting features. And so the first one here are the Gymnosperms. This only includes one species. Interestingly, they're resistant to pollution, and you've probably heard of this one in various kinds of advertisements because it's used as a dietary supplement. Rather, its extracts are used as a dietary supplement to help people's memories, vision, and health. The second lineage that you should know are the cycads. This includes 140 species. Its roots have this symbiotic relationship with cyanobacteria that we've seen before with other plants, and it's important in nitrogen fixation, as you might expect with cyanobacteria. This fourth one, the Coprosophyta, has about 150 species. Now these vary in size greatly. They include some small shrubs and all the way to some of our tallest trees that we know of, the giant redwoods. It's also important because some of the trees in this group, like the yew trees, the Pacific yew tree, produces a chemical called Taxol that can be used as a cancer therapy. Cedars are also in this group, and cedar wood is used for furniture. And then also juniper berries are in this group as well, and they help flavor gin. So a lot of different varieties of plants in this group that have many different functions that humans take advantage of. Our next group here are the Pinophyta. There's about 240 species here, and you've no doubt seen these before. These are our pine trees, our spruce trees, our firs. The wood from these trees are often used in buildings and paper industries. Our last group here are the Nutafidus. There's 70 species of this. They share many features of angiosperms, but they're still a gymnosperm. One thing that we do get from this group is a drug called ephedrine, and you may have heard of this drug, but it's isolated from some of these species, and it's used to treat low blood pressure. Okay, that's all I have for today's video podcast. If you have any questions at all, please let me know. If not, I will see you in class. Bye for now.